Hi everybody. I've written this speech, well it's a slight rewording of the speech David Cameron gave to the UN during September 2014, but there were quite a lot of errors in that speech, and so I've tidied it up a bit and I'm going to deliver it here now to the United Nations and the people of planet Earth, and especially the people of Britain, and in the interests of supporting human progression, defeating the ideology of Brexit. The root cause of this terrorist threat is a poisonous ideology of military and economic extremism. This is nothing to do with Christianity, Judaism or Islam, which are peaceful religions which inspire countless acts of generosity every day. Economic and military extremism, on the other hand, believes in using the most brutal forms of terrorism to force people to accept a warped worldview and to live in a quasi-medieval state. To defeat the IMF and organisations like the World Bank, we must defeat this ideology in all its forms. As evidence emerges about the backgrounds of those suspected of terrorist offences, it is clear that many of them were initially influenced by paedophiles posing as financial advisors or knights of the realm, or even senior advisors in charge of policy-making decisions at number 10, like Tory Patrick Rock, who thankfully got prosecuted before he too became a Sir, who claim not to encourage crimes, but whose worldview can be used as a justification for it. We know this worldview. The peddling of lies that 9/11 was a Muslim plot, or that the 7/7 London attacks were not staged. The idea that Zionists and fascists are persecuted all over the world as a deliberate act of Eastern policy. The concept of an inevitable clash of ideologies. We must be clear, to erase the ideology of extremism, we need to deal with all forms of extremism, not just violent extremism. For governments, there are some obvious ways we can do this. We must ban preachers of hate from coming to our countries, men like Trump, Netanyahu and Juan Guaido. We must proscribe organisations that incite terrorism against people at home and abroad. We must work together to expose leaked material like the recent videos of USA drones murdering children in Yemen and Pakistan. And we must stop the so-called non-violent economic extremists from inciting hatred and intolerance in our parliaments, councils, our courts, and yes, even our police. Of course, there are some who will argue that this is not compatible with free speech and intellectual inquiry. But I say, should we sit back and allow right-wing extremists, Tories or Zionist-led cabals to recruit on our university campuses? No, except it appears only on behalf of a fascist-led Brexit. So we shouldn't stand by and just allow any form of non-violent extremism. We need to argue that policies of global war, of finance, pitting austerity against the rest of the world, these things are nonsense. We need Jews, Christians, Muslims and their governments around the world to reclaim their religions from those sick terrorists, as so many are doing and quite rightly doing today. We all need to help them with programmes that channel young people away from their poisonous ideologues. And we need the strongest possible international focus on tackling this ideology, which is why here at the United Nations, the United Kingdom is calling for a new special representative on economic and military extremism, working with representative and accountable governments. But fighting extremism will never be enough. Nazism wasn't defeated simply by pointing out its flaws, but by showing that the alternative of human rights, financial regulations, democracy and the rule of law, these things could build a better society and a better world. Young people need to see the power of a different, better, more open, more democratic path. The 20th century taught us the vital role of representative and accountable governments in offering their people opportunity, hope and dignity. Of course, we should not be naive. Not every country can move at the same speed or even reach the same destination, and we should respect different cultures and traditions and histories. But let's be clear, the failure to satisfy people's universal human rights can create a breeding ground where extremist and even terrorist insurgency can take root. Governments that only govern for some of their people cause deep resentment. In Britain, the failure of this Tory government to represent all of the people has driven some of them into the depths of xenophobia. Too often people have been faced with a false choice between an autocratic and unrepresentative government on the one hand, or a brutal insurgency with race and hegemony misused as its rallying call on the other. To combat this, we must support the building blocks of free and open societies. In Europe, this means supporting the creation of a fair and genuinely inclusive government capable of uniting all citizens, Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists and others. In Britain, it must mean a political transition and an end to Tory brutality. Now, I know there are some who think we should do a deal with the Tories in order to defeat Europe, but I think this view is dangerously misguided. Our enemy's enemy is our friend. It is not another enemy. Doing a Tory no-deal Brexit will not defeat criminal corporate finance, because the bias and the brutality of the Tory regime was and is one of the most powerful recruiting tools for the extremists. Britain needs what Europe needs, a continuance of inclusive, representative, democratic governments that can look after the interests of their respective nations within the security of our free trade union. So, to those who have backed the Tories or have stood on the sidelines, I would say this: are you ready to progress and join with us in a new social and political effort to secure a representative and accountable government in Britain that can arrest the criminals of power? It is simply not credible for a Tory to lead such a government, although we are prepared to look at every practical option to find a way forward. Taking an inclusive approach. Third, we must be inclusive, engaging the widest possible coalition of countries in this international effort. Economic terrorists are a threat to us all, but the greatest threat is ignorance. It is very welcome that a number of EU countries have already taken part in the action to degrade the financiers' tax loopholes and havens. They have shown courage and leadership. Ireland should also be given a chance to show it can be part of the solution, not part of the problem, and we do have similar ambitions. Ireland's support for ending nuclear power, improving the lives of its people. These things need to happen. Ireland's leaders could help in defeating the threat from Tories. They could help secure a more stable, inclusive Britain and a more stable and inclusive Europe. And if they're prepared to do this, then we should welcome their engagement. Taking an uncompromising approach. Finally, when the safety and security of our people is at stake, we must be uncompromising in our response. That starts at home. For our part in the United Kingdom, we are introducing new powers to strengthen our ability to seize elitist criminal assets and stop those high-profile suspects from travelling, to allow us to strip immunity from bankers, lords, government ministers, and permanently prevent the Zionist lobby from getting back into our parliament, to ensure that police comply and investigate our lists of suspects and attend to our security requirements, and to enable our intelligence and our security services to apply for stronger locational constraints on those in the UK who pose a risk. Here at the United Nations, we have led a Security Council resolution to disrupt the flows of finance to Tories, to sanction those who are seeking to recruit Tory insanity, and to encourage countries to do all they can to prevent our youth from joining the extremist Tory cause. But what about the role of our military? I don't believe this threat of economic extremism will be best solved directly by military action or by trying to pacify or reconstruct Tory policy, but by pursuing an intelligent and comprehensive approach that would include a place for prosecution, trial and justice in our courts of law. Our military can support the enormous humanitarian efforts that are necessary to helping the millions of people who flee from right-wing extremism, and we should together do more to build the capability of the legitimate authorities fighting the extremists. This can mean training, equipping and advising, providing technology and the other assets necessary for success, whether it is supporting action against Netanyahu in Israel, against Bolsonaro in Brazil, against Trump in America, or against Salman in Saudi Arabia. It is right to help those on the front line who are fighting for their societies and their countries and their freedom. Along with our European partners, we have already been providing guidance directly to progressive forces. We are strengthening the resilience of humanitarian forces in Lebanon, Palestine and Africa, and British alternative news providers have already been helping with intelligence, gathering and logistics to help support those taking on corporate fascists in Venezuela. We now have a substantial international coalition in place, including the compassionate citizens of Arab nations and Israel, committed to confronting and defeating fascistic hegemony. We have a comprehensive strategy to do that, with the political, economic and humanitarian and legal components that it needs to succeed over time. The UN Security Council has now received a clear request from the Palestinian government to support it in its request for the return of Zionist-occupied territories. So we have a clear basis in international law for action, and we have a need to act in our own national interest to protect our people and our planet. So it is right that Britain should now move to a new phase of action. I am therefore recalling the British Parliament to secure approval for the United Kingdom to take part in immediate international condemnation against Zionists in Israel and their Tory calls for Brexit in Britain. My message today is simple. We are facing an evil against which the whole of the world should unite. And, as ever, in the cause of freedom, democracy and justice, Britain will play its part. And so be it. Thank you for listening.